Discuss more of this with someone who has plenty. Alpesh Patel is from Fabini & Partners.
I've had my coffee.
Have you? Oh, good. Well, then you're perky enough. Perky enough. Mr. Obama's pretty perky, pretty forthright.
How very patronising of the American president to say to us in the EU, where some of our countries have AAA rating, Mr. Obama, cats and kettles and all the rest of it. The actual advice he should have given to the Europeans, rather than just saying, you must do something, which essentially is what he was saying, is to devalue, to print money, and thereby devalue. We don't have much inflation, and if, for instance, the Italians, when their debt comes due, instead of the Italians saying to their corporations, we're going to tax you even more, and to their people, we're going to tax you until it hurts, they said, well, actually, we're not going to do that. We're going to take printed money and repay the debt that we have to pay. And all that will do is just reduce the value of the euro somewhat, which is what it would have done in the old days if we didn't have structures which stop printing of money.
Interesting, though, when you look at actually what Obama had to say. He says the US was very actively engaged with Europe and stands ready to do its part. So what would the US do exactly in terms of practical help?
Exactly. What can they do? Perhaps they can say, devalue, print money. And they can pick up the phone to the Germans and say, look, get over your fear of inflation. The Weimar Republic was many decades ago, and it's not going to be a problem again. That's all he can do, because they don't have any money themselves. They have it far less than we do in Europe, in any event. What he should remember, when, again...
So in terms of practical help, it's literally just putting pressure, political pressure on political leaders in Europe?
Which
is that
actually,
what you're saying?
It sounds less relevant than it is, but actually that gives firepower and some coverage to the Germans or to the political leaders to say, well, actually, look, this is a plan that the Americans back, and that's very important because it gives reassurance and hope to the people of Europe when you've also got American backing. But yes, that's all. It's not going to be money. They don't have any.
What about the role of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund? Because earlier in the week there was some excitement, wasn't there, that it may be helping out Italy. That's been denied. But what about its role now? Should it be considering bailing out or at least offering more aid to Europe?
Not really, because that's debt which is just being moved from one set of nations to another group of nations. The best way that we have at the moment of wiping off that debt is to print the money.
And when you say that, you mean the European Central Bank?
Yes.
Quantitative easing?
No, I mean, I don't mean that they simply just print money to buy bonds. I mean, they directly go to the printing press and say, the next set of debt which is due for repayment will be paid by the ECB on behalf of the Italians. There will be no debt as a result by the Italians.
And that's the idea that Angela Merkel's very opposed to, isn't it? Or Germany's very opposed to.
Absolutely, because it's considered to be inflationary, because the Germans have experience of this in the early part of last century.
Well, then now the governments appear to be looking at their own banks, saying, well, you need to hold on
these are
to
desperate
these
measures,
bonds. I mean,
they?
these are lenders of last resort, perhaps, here.
Yeah, and this is the story, as you say, from the Wall Street Journal. Money is, it's a fiction. We all know it's a fiction because it's not tied to the gold standard. There isn't something underlying it. And like most fictions, it requires everybody to believe in its value. So what the central banks are saying is, please don't sell our terrible debt, because then everybody else will start selling. Now I could use the cliche of House of Cards, domino effect, or so on, but essentially that's what they're trying to say. Please uphold this fiction, that these debts are actually worth something, these bonds are worth something. And that's what they're trying to do. But you're right, if you've got to go to your own banks in Portugal to try and help you bail you out...
Well, I was going to say, because these banks are so overexposed anyway, and that's the real fear about European banking sector, that it's so overexposed and carrying too much of this toxic debt already.
Exactly.
Instead,
if you said we've got repayments to make, because who are the bondholders who need repaying by the Portuguese central government or the Italian central government? It is a variety of banks. If we said, yes, here you are, you've been repaid, and the capital has come from the ECB, it's come from the printing presses, then you've reduced the pressure on the consumer, because they don't have to be taxed to hell and back. You've reduced the pressure on corporations. They can get on with business planning. They can get on with planning for growth, for investment, because they're not going to be taxed an indeterminate amount for an unclear period of time. And that's the problem at the moment.
Let's move on, because Egypt is still something that we're definitely keeping a very close eye on. And we mustn't forget, you know, there's this prospect now of a shaky democracy beginning, but the stories behind many of these people who have fought for this vote are still very touching.
Yes, that's right. The democracy, rather like capitalism, also requires us to believe in a fiction that it's at least the least worst of all the systems with democracy. And the great thing, as with capitalism, is it gives you a degree of hope that one day you too, in the case of capitalism, will be rich. In the case of democracy, will not be abused.
You'll have a voice.
You'll have a voice, and this is the headline. For the first time, my vote will make a difference. Of course. I'm not going to be cynical about it, but one person defined democracy as it's 10 times in your lifetime that you'll go to the ballot box, and that's democracy. And it is a nice little fiction, but at least it gives us hope. And this person has hope, and let's encourage them.
But Alpesh, you can't... I mean, I think it's easy for us, isn't it, here in the UK and in countries where we've known nothing else other than democracy, for those of us of our generation, to perhaps, not sort of undermine the significance of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
for someone,
they have hope.
For someone who's never ever known a democracy, who's never voted, who's always been governed by a regime that they felt was,
And their problems are not gone, but you will find the poorest, most destitute people in the world. I'm not saying all Egyptians are in that situation, who've been trampled upon, their dreams have been crushed. They will find that hope in the ballot box, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But let's hope that they deliver on what is, to some extent, a fiction.
Well, it's a long road, isn't it, to change?
And thankfully the world is watching for a change. It's watching Egypt, and hopefully we'll do something about it the next time things go off the rails, which doubtless they will in not just this country but many others. But at least now the world is watching, because when was Egypt at the front page of a Western newspaper other than in the last year? And if we continue watching, then hopefully their leaders will have more pressure, and the world won't be asleep at the wheel as it's been for the last 30 years when it's come to the Middle East.
Shall we look at the UK? Because, of course, Chancellor Osborne is going to issue the autumn statement today, but there's this need, isn't there, for investment in infrastructure. I know you've been travelling just recently, looking as part of UK trade investment and looking at who, perhaps, may be interested in investing in the UK.
Yes.
Should the UK be hopeful?
Absolutely, and look at the wonderful headline. After all the stories that we just discussed where we mentioned the word hope, the headline itself mentions hope. I've been with UK Trade and Investment to Malaysia, Singapore, India and Dubai in the last 5 days. Just got back 20 hours ago, and I have to tell you, from each of those countries, from what I can tell, they're queuing up to invest in the United Kingdom, not least because we're part of the $12 trillion GDP of the EU, not least because we're not in the Eurozone in the UK, and not least because companies like Tata make £1 billion in profits here from manufacturing, from research and development, and we have amazing infrastructure to begin with. Now, I know these are not the kinds of things which politicians like to sing about unless they're in government, because that's their job, but when they're in opposition they don't want to say it. But speaking as a business person, this is a very attractive location, and I'm not asking for anybody's vote. It is genuinely an attractive location because people are getting a return on their money because of the skilled labour in this country, because of the infrastructure we already have. This is a great policy because it's public spending which is going to invest for future growth.
It's nice that you ended on a positive note.
Who'd have thought it?
At least for those in the UK.
Hope should stand for US President.
There's a message to leave to end on.
Original.
Alpesh, thank you very much for joining us. From Sally and myself, it's goodbye for now.
Bye-bye. See you soon.